Hashtag part 1. The heartbreaking decision. It was a cold, silent night when she walked away from everything she knew. The only sound was the soft crunch of snow beneath her boots as she moved away from the house, away from her family. There was no turning back now. Every step she took away from that door felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders, but also a piece of her heart breaking. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay. Not after everything that had happened. Every moment she had given, every ounce of love she had poured into that house, it was never enough. They never saw her. They never truly saw the sacrifices she made, the dreams she gave up to keep them together. The air was cold, but it wasn't enough to freeze the pain in her chest. It was as if a storm had built up inside her, and walking away was the only way to make it stop. She thought about the arguments, the nights she spent waiting for them to see her, to appreciate her. It never came. She was always the one who kept the peace, the one who sacrificed, the one who put everyone else first. But they took it all for granted. As she walked, she let the tears fall. She didn't care anymore. There was no one to stop her, no one to tell her to stay. The world felt cold, but it felt strangely freeing, too. She had been walking this path for so long, pleasing everyone, making sure everyone else was happy. Now, it was time to walk for herself. The wind picked up, but she didn't feel the chill. She had been numb for so long that nothing could hurt her now. Not the cold, not the loneliness. She could hear the voices in her mind telling her that she had made a mistake, that maybe she was being impulsive, but she couldn't stop. The memories of the empty dinners, the ignored pleas for help, the hours spent trying to fix things that weren't even broken, it all flooded back. She kept walking, not knowing where she was heading. The world outside seemed vast, endless. It felt like she was starting a new chapter, even though she had no idea what was on the other side. But there was no going back. And as the darkness wrapped around her, she couldn't help but wonder if anyone would notice her absence. Would they care? Would they come looking for her? But deep inside, she already knew the answer. She had waited for years, always hoping that things would change, that they would realize how much she meant. But now, she had to walk away. It was the only thing she could do to save herself. Her footsteps grew softer as she continued down the road, the weight of her decision settling into her bones. There was no going back now. Whatever came next, she would face it alone. And for the first time in years, she felt like she might finally have the chance to breathe. But what would happen when she realized that walking away might be harder than she ever thought? Only time would tell. Hashtag part 2. The struggles of starting over. The bus ride to the next town was long, with nothing to focus on except the hum of the engine and the cold silence that wrapped around her. She sat in the corner, staring out the window, watching the landscape blur by, yet feeling completely disconnected from it all. She had left everything behind, her family, her home, the life she had built for herself, and now, here she was, a stranger in a strange town with nothing but a small bag and a handful of change. She stepped off the bus and onto the cracked pavement, the chill of the air seeping into her bones. The town was quiet, almost too quiet. The buildings were old, the streetlights dim. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel like she could disappear into the shadows. She needed to disappear, at least for a while. She needed to escape the weight of her past, to find a place where no one knew her, where she could just breathe. The first night was the hardest. She wandered through the streets, unsure of where to go, too afraid to ask for help. There were no familiar faces, no safety nets, just a cold world waiting for her to make the next move. She found a small bench in a quiet corner of a park and sat there, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she ignored it. She could survive on nothing for a while. She had no choice. It was the loneliness that hit the hardest. She had always been surrounded by people, family, friends, colleagues, but now, she was completely alone. No one to talk to, no one to share her pain with. Every time she closed her eyes, memories flooded back. The hurtful words, the indifference, the feeling that no matter what she did, she would never be enough. It had all led her to this point. The next morning, she found a small diner on the corner, its neon sign flickering in the early light. She walked in, hesitated at the door, and then pushed it open. The bell above the door jingled softly, and a few heads turned to glance at her. The woman behind the counter smiled warmly, as if she had been waiting for her to walk in. "Coffee?" the woman asked kindly, her voice soft, almost comforting. She nodded, too tired to say anything else. The woman filled a mug and slid it across the counter. "You look like you could use a break. Sit down and relax. We're not in any rush here." For the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to breathe. The warmth of the coffee spread through her, and for a moment, she forgot about the weight she was carrying. She was just another person in this strange town, trying to find her way. Maybe it was all going to be okay. As she sat there, sipping her coffee, a man sitting at the table near her struck up a conversation. He was older, his face weathered by time, but his eyes had a kind, understanding look. He asked her what brought her to town, and she smiled weakly, unsure of what to say. "Just looking for a fresh start," she said quietly. The man nodded, as though he understood. "Sometimes we need to get away, don't we? The past can be a heavy burden. But you'll find your way, don't worry. Life has a funny way of working itself out." She wasn't sure what to make of his words, but they stuck with her. Maybe he was right. Maybe she could make a new life here. But the truth was, she didn't know where to begin. That night, as she lay in the small, dimly lit room she had rented, she thought about everything she had left behind. The pain, the heartache, it was all still with her. She couldn't shake it, no matter how hard she tried. The loneliness weighed on her more heavily than she expected. But there was also a strange sense of freedom. She had taken the first step toward something new, something different. Could she find happiness again? Could she rebuild her life from the ground up? The answer didn't come right away. But as she drifted off to sleep, exhausted by the day's emotions, she realized one thing: she had made it this far. And that, at least, was something. Days turned into weeks, and the small town began to feel a little less foreign. She found herself adjusting to a new rhythm, one that was quieter, simpler. She woke up early each day, had her coffee at the diner, and worked the late shift at a local bookstore. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get by. The work was simple, just sorting books and ringing up customers, but it allowed her to breathe without being weighed down by constant reminders of the past. The shop owner, a middle-aged man with glasses perched on the tip of his nose, was a quiet soul, just like her. They didn't speak much, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. They didn't need words. His calm presence gave her some peace, even though she was still learning to find peace within herself. One afternoon, as she was shelving books in the far corner of the store, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me," the man said, stepping closer. "Do you have anything on the art of letting go?" She looked up, a little surprised by the question. The man was well-dressed, his demeanor polished and confident, a stark contrast to her own worn-out appearance. But there was something in his eyes, a sadness, perhaps, that she recognized. "We do have some books on the subject," she replied, her voice steady but soft. She walked over to the shelves and scanned the titles before pulling one down. "This one might help," she said, handing it to him. The man smiled, taking the book with a nod of thanks. "You look like someone who knows what it's like to let go." For a moment, she just stared at him. There was something in his tone, in the way he spoke, that made her heart skip a beat. She couldn't explain why, but there was a connection, a quiet recognition. She wasn't sure if she should say anything, but something made her take a chance. "It's not easy," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Letting go, I mean." The man's expression softened. He placed the book on the counter and turned toward her. "No, it's never easy. But sometimes, it's the only way to move forward." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words. They lingered in the air, a reminder that she wasn't the only one struggling with the ghosts of the past. They all had their burdens to bear. He thanked her and left, but she couldn't shake the conversation from her mind. There was something about it that resonated with her, something that sparked a tiny flame of hope. Maybe letting go was the key to moving forward, but what would she have to give up in the process? Could she ever truly let go of everything that had come before her? The next day, as she opened the bookstore, a letter was slipped under the door. It was simple, just her name written on the envelope in elegant handwriting. She opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Inside, there was only a short note: "Sometimes, the ones we walk away from aren't the ones who truly loved us. But don't let that stop you from learning to love yourself again." She stared at the words, her heart racing. Who had sent it? Was it a coincidence that she had just spoken about letting go with that man, and now this note appeared? Or was it more than that? It felt like the universe was trying to tell her something, but she didn't know what. Still, as she tucked the note into her pocket, a part of her felt something shift inside. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she had a glimpse of something better. The idea of moving forward didn't seem so impossible anymore. Maybe, just maybe, she could let go of the past and embrace the possibility of a future she never thought she would have. The days became a blur of routine, working at the bookstore, grabbing a coffee at the diner, and spending the nights in her small apartment. The newness of the town had faded, and in its place, an overwhelming sense of loneliness began to creep in again. She was learning to be on her own, but that didn't mean it was easy. The weight of her past still clung to her, heavy and unrelenting. She had walked away from her family, but she couldn't walk away from the memories. No matter how far she ran, they would always find a way back into her mind. She had tried to drown them out with work, with the quiet comfort of the small bookstore, but they kept resurfacing in her dreams, her family's faces twisted in anger and disappointment, their voices echoing in her ears, reminding her of the failures she felt deep down. One evening, as she was closing up the bookstore, her phone buzzed on the counter. She had stopped checking it weeks ago, not wanting to hear from anyone. But tonight, something made her pick it up. She saw a message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words. "We need to talk. Something has happened. Please, call me." Her breath caught in her throat. It was from one of her family members. She didn't recognize the number, but the message was enough to send a chill down her spine. Something had happened. She didn't know if she was ready to hear what it was, but she knew she had no choice. After a long moment of hesitation, she called the number back. The phone rang 3 times before someone picked up. "Hello?" Her voice faltered. "It's me," she said, her throat tight. "What's going on? What happened?" There was a pause on the other end. Then, the voice spoke again, softer this time. "It's about your father. He's sick. Really sick. We need you to come home." Her heart dropped to her stomach. Her father? Sick? She couldn't believe it. They hadn't spoken in months. She had left for a reason, and now, here they were, asking her to come back because of a health crisis. She wanted to say no. She wanted to hang up the phone and walk away. But something in her heart told her to stay on the line, to listen. "What's wrong with him?" she asked, her voice shaking. "He's in the hospital. They say he doesn't have much time left. We need you. Please." The words hung in the air, like a heavy weight, suffocating her. She had walked away from them because they never saw her, never appreciated her. But now, they were asking for her help. Was it too late? Could she really go back, after everything that had happened? The silence stretched on as she processed the news. A part of her wanted to go back, to be there for him, but another part of her knew the pain it would bring. The unresolved anger, the resentment, it had been buried deep, but it was still there, just beneath the surface. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll come." The decision felt like a betrayal to everything she had tried to build for herself, but she couldn't ignore the truth in her heart. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the years of being unseen, she still cared. She couldn't turn her back on them now, even if it meant reopening old wounds. She packed a small bag that night, unsure of what awaited her back home. Was she strong enough to face the ghosts of her past? Or was she just walking back into a storm that would destroy everything she had worked so hard to rebuild? As the bus pulled away from the small town the next morning, she looked out the window, the landscape rushing by. The weight of what she was about to face settled in her chest, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone. Maybe, just maybe, she could face the past and find a way to heal. Or maybe it would be too much. The only thing she knew for sure was that the future would be shaped by what she decided next. #### Part 5. Returning to the place she swore to forget. The bus ride back to her old town felt like an eternity. The familiar landmarks passed by in a blur, but they didn't feel familiar anymore. Everything had changed, her, the town, her family. The only thing that remained the same was the weight in her chest, the nagging feeling that she was walking back into a storm she had tried so hard to escape. As the bus pulled into the station, she took a deep breath, forcing herself to steady her nerves. The town hadn't changed much. The same old buildings, the same worn-out street signs, the same quiet atmosphere. But as she stepped off the bus, it all felt different. The streets were now full of memories, memories that she had buried deep inside her, hoping they would stay forgotten. But they weren't gone. They were waiting for her. Her feet carried her toward her old house, without her even realizing it. She hadn't planned to go there first, but somehow, that's where she ended up. The front door was still the same rusty handle and cracked paint. The garden, once vibrant with flowers, now looked neglected, the weeds overtaking everything. She stood in front of the door for a long time, her heart pounding in her chest. Should she go in? Should she knock? Or should she turn around and walk away, just like she had before? But she couldn't. Not this time. She had already made the decision to come back, and she couldn't leave again. She wasn't that person anymore. Taking a deep breath, she reached out and knocked. The sound echoed in the quiet street, and for a moment, it felt as if the world had stopped. She waited, her heart racing, her palms sweating. A moment later, the door creaked open, and there stood her mother. The years had changed her, but not in the way she expected. Her mother looked older, more tired, but there was a softness in her eyes when she saw her. "You came back," her mother said quietly, her voice trembling. She nodded, unable to find the words. Her mother stepped aside, wordlessly inviting her in. She hesitated for just a moment, then crossed the threshold, stepping back into the house she had once called home. The inside hadn't changed much either. The same familiar smells, the same furniture, the same photographs on the walls. But it didn't feel like home anymore. The warmth of the house was gone, replaced by an emptiness that hung in the air. "Your father's in the living room," her mother said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's waiting for you." Her heart sank. She hadn't expected to see him like this, weak, fragile, barely holding on. It felt like a punch to the gut. She had come back to help, but she didn't know if she was ready to face him. Not after everything. But she had no choice. She had to face him, just like she had to face the truth. The truth that she still cared, that despite all the pain and anger, she wasn't entirely ready to let go. She walked into the living room, where her father sat in a chair, his face pale, his eyes distant. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. The years of silence between them felt like an insurmountable wall, and yet, in that moment, all she could feel was the weight of everything unsaid. "I'm sorry," her father finally whispered, his voice rough. "I never meant for you to leave. I don't know how I failed you." She couldn't hold back the tears anymore. The dam inside her broke, and she let them fall. For all the years of hurt, all the anger she had carried with her, she realized that she had never stopped loving him. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about healing. "I didn't want to leave," she said through her tears. "But you didn't see me. You never saw what I was giving up." I had to walk away, or I would have lost myself. Her father's eyes softened. I see you now. And I'm sorry it took me so long. The words were simple, but they were enough. They weren't a solution, but they were a start. In that moment, the past didn't feel as heavy. It wasn't gone, but it felt more like something they could finally face together. She sat down beside him, the weight of the years between them starting to lift. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she might be able to rebuild what had been broken. Maybe it wouldn't be easy, and maybe it wouldn't be perfect, but it was a beginning. And that, for now, was enough. As the hours passed, the conversations began to flow more easily. They talked about everything, the past, the present, and the future. They were no longer just a family in name, but a family trying to find their way back to each other. And though the road ahead would be difficult, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't alone anymore. Part 6. The shocking truth. The days that followed were a strange mix of emotions. There was an uneasy peace in the house now that she was back, but it wasn't the same. The anger, the resentment, the hurt, they all lingered in the background like uninvited guests, just waiting for the right moment to resurface. But for now, they were quiet, as if even they knew they had to give her space. Her father's condition worsened with each passing day. He was frail, his body weakened by the illness that had taken over him. His once strong hands now trembled when he reached for a glass of water, and his once booming voice was now reduced to a soft whisper. Despite everything that had happened between them, seeing him like this stirred something inside her, a mixture of pity, guilt, and regret. One evening, as she sat by his bedside, he looked at her with tired eyes and said something that made her heart stop. "There's something you need to know, something I should have told you a long time ago," he said, his voice barely audible. She leaned in, her heart racing. The quiet, almost fragile way he spoke made her wonder what he was about to say. Was this the moment she had been waiting for, the explanation that would finally make sense of everything? "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is it?" He took a shallow breath, then spoke slowly, carefully. "I wasn't always the man you think I was. I've made mistakes. A lot of mistakes." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "You weren't the only one who suffered. I did too. I wasn't just a bad father. I was a bad husband. I didn't know how to love your mother the way she needed. I didn't know how to love you the way you needed." She sat there, stunned into silence. Her father, the man who had always seemed so strong, had always been her anchor, was now admitting that he, too, had fallen short. He had failed them both, in ways that were deeper than she had ever imagined. "I made choices, wrong choices. I shut everyone out, including your mother. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I was wrong. And by the time I realized it, it was too late. Too late for me to fix things. Too late for us." Her chest tightened as she listened to him. She had always believed that her father was strong, that he was untouchable, that he had all the answers. But now, she realized that he, too, was just as broken as she had been. The walls he had built around himself were the same walls she had built to protect herself from the pain. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you let me in?" He closed his eyes briefly, a tear slipping down his cheek. "Because I was ashamed. Ashamed of failing you. Ashamed of failing your mother. And I thought that if I kept pretending, if I kept acting like everything was fine, it would be easier. But it wasn't." She felt a lump in her throat as the truth settled in. All these years, she had blamed him, blamed her family for everything that had gone wrong in her life. But now, she realized that they were all just people, flawed and imperfect, doing the best they could with what they had. They had all suffered, in their own ways, but in the end, they were still a family. Still connected by the love they had shared, even if it had been buried under so much pain. Her father's words hung in the air like a heavy weight, but instead of feeling bitter, instead of feeling angry, she felt something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Understanding. I don't know if we can fix everything, she said softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. But we can try. We can try to heal. Together. Her father nodded slowly, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I would like that. More than you know. For the first time in years, it felt like the door to forgiveness was finally opening. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But they had taken the first step, together. And that, in itself, was a small victory. As she sat by her father's side that night, holding his hand, she knew that things would never be the same. The past would always be there, lingering in the background. But now, it didn't have to define her. It didn't have to define them. For the first time, she felt a spark of hope that, despite everything, they could still rebuild. And that, maybe, was the most important truth of all. The next few weeks passed slowly, and with each day, the house seemed to breathe a little more life. The quiet tension that had hung in the air for so long was beginning to lift, but there was still so much left unsaid. She had opened the door to forgiveness, but she wasn't sure if her heart was truly ready to let go of the past. Her father's condition continued to decline, but in his fragile state, he seemed more vulnerable than ever. Their conversations were quiet, but meaningful. He would apologize again and again, and she would listen, her heart torn between the need to forgive and the lingering pain that still haunted her. She was learning to let go of the anger, but it wasn't easy. The wounds were deep, and the scars remained. One evening, as she sat beside him, her father reached for her hand. His grip was weak, but there was a sincerity in his eyes that she hadn't seen in years. I know I can never make up for what I've done, he said softly, his voice strained. I know that I hurt you. But please know that I'm sorry. More than anything, I'm sorry. She looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of everything they had been through. For so long, she had been angry at him, angry at herself for staying so long, angry at the family she had once loved. But now, as she looked at him, she realized that forgiveness wasn't just about him. It was about her, too. She nodded, squeezing his hand gently. I know, Dad. I know. And I'm sorry, too. For leaving without saying goodbye. For walking away when you needed me most. I was just so lost. He smiled faintly, as if he understood. There were no more harsh words, no more blaming each other for what had happened. There was just the quiet understanding that they had both made mistakes, but that they still had time to heal. The next day, as she went about her chores around the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The anger was fading, replaced by a tentative peace. But there was still one more conversation to be had, the hardest one of all. That evening, as the sun began to set, she sat down with her mother in the kitchen. Her mother had been quiet in the week since her return, her face drawn and tired, but there was something in her eyes that spoke volumes. She had forgiven her husband, but was she ready to forgive her daughter? Her mother spoke first, her voice soft, but steady. I've been thinking a lot about everything. About how we treated you, how I treated you. She paused, taking a deep breath. I'm sorry, too. I'm sorry that I didn't see you. I didn't see the pain you were going through. I was so wrapped up in my own hurt that I couldn't see yours. Her mother's words hung in the air, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. The weight of everything, her mother's neglect, her own feelings of being overlooked, was too much. But slowly, she realized something. This wasn't about blaming her mother anymore. It wasn't about holding on to the hurt. It was about moving forward. I was angry, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I was angry that you never saw me, that you never understood. But I see now that I was angry because I needed you to be something you couldn't be. And I'm sorry for that. Her mother reached out, taking her hand in hers. You don't need to apologize. I wasn't there for you when you needed me, but I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The last remnants of her anger began to dissolve, replaced by the realization that forgiveness wasn't a one-way street. It was something that had to be given, but it had to be received, too. Her mother had hurt her, but she, too, had suffered. And now, they had both been given the chance to heal. The next few days were a blur. Her father's condition worsened, and she found herself spending more time by his side. But instead of the bitterness she had once felt, there was only a sense of peace. Peace that came from knowing they had shared their truths. Peace that came from knowing they were no longer fighting against each other, but fighting together for the time they had left. The hardest part was still ahead, saying goodbye. But she knew, deep down, that they had done what they could to make amends. They had forgiven, and in doing so, they had found the strength to heal. It wasn't easy. It never would be. But in the end, forgiveness was the key that unlocked the door to peace. And for the first time in years, she felt the weight lifting from her shoulders. She had walked away from her family, but now, she was walking back toward them, not just as a daughter, but as someone who had learned that sometimes, the hardest thing isn't leaving. It's staying, and loving, and forgiving. Her father's condition had deteriorated rapidly, and the house felt more like a waiting room than a home. Every day, she sat by his side, watching him struggle to hold on to the last shreds of strength he had left. There were moments when his eyes would flicker with recognition, moments when he would smile weakly, but there were just as many moments when he would drift off into unconsciousness, as if he were too tired to fight. It was in one of those moments, as she sat quietly in the chair beside him, that her mother came into the room, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't spoken much in the past few days, lost in her own grief, but now, there was something different in her eyes, a mix of determination and fear. "I need to talk to you," her mother said quietly, motioning for her to follow her into the kitchen. She followed, her heart pounding in her chest. What could this be about? What more was there to say? Her mother stood by the window, staring out at the empty garden. She was holding a letter, her hands shaking slightly. "This came for you," she said, her voice tight. "I've been holding on to it. I wasn't sure if I should give it to you." She held out the envelope, and her daughter took it, her fingers brushing against her mother's hand. It wasn't a letter from the past, no, it was something new, something that had arrived only a day before. She opened it slowly, her breath caught in her throat as she read the words. The letter was from a lawyer her family had never dealt with before. The contents of the letter made her stomach twist. "I'm sorry," her mother whispered. "I didn't know what to do with it. It's about your father's will. He left something for you." Her mind raced. What could he possibly have left for her? After everything that had happened, after all the years of silence and hurt, what could he possibly have to give her now? Her hands trembled as she read further. The letter outlined a sum of money, a property, and the request to meet with the lawyer in person to settle matters. But there was something else, something that shook her to the core. "Your father," her mother continued, voice wavering, "he didn't just leave you money. He left you something else, something that might change everything you thought you knew about him." A strange sense of dread settled over her. What could it be? Was it another secret, another lie buried deep beneath the surface? Her mother took a deep breath, her eyes filled with pain. "He's been holding on to this for years. I didn't know about it. No one did. But when he was diagnosed, he asked me to keep it safe for you. A letter from your real mother." The world seemed to stop for a moment. A letter from her real mother? She had never known anyone else, had never imagined there was more to her family than what she had seen. What was this about? Her mind spun, the words repeating in her head. She had always known something was off, something was missing, but she had never expected this. Her father, the man who had never spoken of her mother, who had always acted as if they were just a simple family, had kept this secret from her all along. Her hand shook as she opened the letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, delicate, and precise. The words on the page seemed to blur as she read them, each sentence more shocking than the last. "My dear child, if you are reading this, then your father has failed to give you the truth. He never told you that I was your mother. I gave you up when you were just a baby, thinking I was doing the right thing. I didn't know how to be a mother, didn't know how to keep you. But now, as I near the end of my life, I want you to know the truth. You were always meant to be more than just the daughter of a broken family. You were meant for greatness, meant to live a life full of purpose. I followed your journey from afar, watched you struggle, watched you grow. And now, I hope you will understand that your true strength has always been within you, regardless of the family you thought you had. I hope this letter finds you with an open heart. Know that I never wanted to abandon you, but I did it out of fear. You are loved, more than you'll ever know. She let the letter fall from her hands, the words echoing in her mind. Her true mother? The woman who had left her all those years ago? What was all of this? How had this secret remained buried for so long? Her heart was racing, her mind in chaos. She turned to her mother, who stood in silence, her face pale with regret. I didn't know, her mother whispered. I didn't know. He never told me, either. He said it was for your own good, that you would never need to know. But now, it seems like it's time. Her entire world felt like it was crumbling. She had thought she understood everything. She had thought she had been abandoned by her father, left to deal with a broken family. But now, she was learning that her whole life had been a lie. The truth, hidden away for so long, had finally come to light. She didn't know how to feel. Anger? Betrayal? Relief? And yet, even through all the confusion, there was something else stirring inside her, something deeper, something stronger. She had been searching for answers, searching for meaning in a world that had never seemed to make sense. Now, with the truth staring her in the face, she realized one thing: she could either let this truth break her, or she could use it to build a new future. The final piece of her past had been revealed. Now, it was up to her to decide how she would move forward. The revelation of her true mother, the secrets buried in the past, and the reality of her father's choices had left her reeling. She sat there, holding the letter, unable to shake the flood of emotions that surged within her. Betrayal, confusion, anger, so many feelings tangled up inside her. But there was also something else, something quieter, buried beneath all the turmoil: clarity. For so long, she had felt like an outsider in her own family, like she was never truly seen. She had walked away because she felt unimportant, invisible, and unloved. But now, faced with the truth, she realized that none of that was really the case. Her father had tried to protect her in his own way, though his actions had created more harm than good. Her real mother, too, had loved her in her own imperfect way, even from a distance. It was all too much, and yet, it was also exactly what she needed. She had spent so many years trying to understand her place in the world, trying to make sense of the broken relationships that had shaped her. But now, she realized something profound. The past did not define her. It was the choices she made today, the way she faced her pain and carried herself forward, that truly mattered. Her father's time was running out, and though their relationship had been fractured, the truth had given them a chance to heal, if only just a little. As his life hung in the balance, she found herself sitting at his bedside once again, his frail body barely able to lift itself. He barely recognized her anymore, but his eyes were still filled with something: remorse, love, or perhaps just the deep regret of not having been the father he had wished to be. "You've forgiven me, haven't you?" he asked one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. Her heart caught in her chest. Could she truly forgive him? All the years of neglect, the mistakes, the misunderstandings? Could she let go of all the hurt and anger that had built up inside her? "I have," she said softly, her voice steady, despite the emotion swirling within her. "I've forgiven you because I know you were just as lost as I was. And I know now that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about letting go of the burden of the past." Her father closed his eyes slowly, as though he had been waiting for this moment, waiting to hear those words. She couldn't undo the years they had lost, but she could choose to move forward, free of the resentment that had been weighing her down. As the days passed and her father's health continued to decline, she found herself with a new sense of purpose. She didn't need to know every answer about her past. She didn't need to understand every choice her parents had made. What mattered now was how she chose to live her life moving forward. She had the power to create her own future, no matter where she had come from. Her father passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the family he had never truly understood but who had, in the end, forgiven him. The loss hit her hard, but in the quiet moments after, she found a strange peace. The past was behind her, but the lessons it had taught her would stay with her forever. She stood in the garden one last time, the place where so many memories had been made. The flowers were wilting, the grass overgrown, but she didn't mind. It was a reflection of her own journey, wild, untamed, and full of unexpected beauty. She could finally see that everything, even the pain, had led her to this moment, to this understanding. "I am enough," she whispered to herself, the words filling her with strength. "I am enough, just as I am." The world felt a little lighter now. She had walked away from her family, yes. But she had also come back to find something deeper, herself. And that, more than anything, was the greatest gift she could have given herself. She walked away from the garden with her head held high, ready to embrace whatever came next. She didn't need to carry the weight of the past anymore. She was free. And with that, she finally understood, sometimes the hardest thing is not walking away, but walking forward with the wisdom of what you've left behind.